everybody. This is Todd Dewey from Ice Road Truckers on the History Channel, and I love to listen to TNC Radio.live.
Good afternoon. Welcome to TNC Radio.live. This is the Truckers Network Radio Show. And now here's your host, Shelley Johnson.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that. Yes, this is the Truckers Network Radio Show on TNCRadio.live, where we offer the entertainment, sports, weather, traffic, news, and information that commercial drivers want to hear. We featured a number of former drivers who are authors, but we've never featured anyone from the UK or the land down under. Today we have the privilege of speaking with R.A. Dalkey, who drove trucks in the Australian Outback. Richard is a journalist and author of who's written the book The Road to Innamincka. He's now based in Europe and has some very interesting stories to tell us, along with some insight on what's going on in the trucking industry in Europe as well. Welcome, Richard. Thank you so much for being on the show. You've had quite the diverse background.
I have indeed, as we were just discussing off air, lots of different hats that I wear, and lived in 5 different countries. So there would be a lot to cover if I went into all that in detail. But it's great to be here, and thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. What inspired you to drive in the Outback? Was that something you always wanted to do as a child, or?
Pretty much, yes. I'm sure all of your North American listeners will be familiar with National Geographic magazine, famous as it is. Mm-hmm. And we had that in South Africa back in the 80s when I was growing up. And that was basically how I traveled, right, was flicking through that magazine. And they had quite a few features on Australia at that time, especially in February. There was February 1988. There was a big special on Australia. And of course, regularly in that magazine and a few others, pictures of those great big road trains in Australia and those drivers covered in dust. And something about that grabbed me when I was 8 or 9 years old. And I started, putting on Australian accents and pretending to be a Aussie road train driver. And I said, I'm going to do this one day. And I just never grew out of it. So yeah, I was into my 30s and still hadn't dropped the idea, and finally ended up doing it for a few months.
So what's it like? How is the Outback different than other areas of the world?
Well, it is to the untrained eye very, very samey. I will say that. I mean, I would love to go with an expert like a native Australian who could explain all the different plants and what's going on with nature and why it actually isn't all the same, because I'm sure it's not. But for a fool like me who doesn't really know much about what's going on in a detailed level on the landscape, it really does look like you're kind of going through the same landscape all the time. Mm-hmm. Especially when you get anywhere near the middle of the continent. You've got that kind of reddish soil that Australia is really famous for. Very rarely do you have much more than a few rocks piled on top of each other. You could barely call them a hill. And you just have this spiky grass popping up every now and then, and that's pretty much what it looks like. And really, you're either going to be on a bitumen road, as they call it, a sealed tarmac surface, if I'm allowed to say that, or you're going to be on a horrible dirt track, which I guess is where the real hardcore trucking assignments are. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I got to go down a few rutted dirt tracks for many hours at a time, and that did hurt after a while, especially the corrugations. Yeah. But the highways are good. The only thing that I found really weird was, and I don't know how this compares to the States because I haven't driven really long distance in the States very much, but in Australia, you can be taking Highway 1, really the most important road going around the country, and pretty much all the way, you only have 2 lanes. I don't mean 2 in both directions. I mean just 2 total. And there's no space on the left-hand side of the road. That's your outside, as you would drive in Australia on the left. It feels very squashed. You have that white line down the left, and then you're into the dust, and then you have a road train coming at you on your right-hand side, and you just want to pull over and give it a bit of space, especially as a rookie driver.
Oh, sure.
And didn't get that chance. Very, very scary in the beginning. In fact, it never stopped being scary.
For those who aren't familiar, what is a road train?
So, yeah, it is a weird kind of term, and I think it's unique to Australia, if I'm not mistaken. So, it's really a truck with so many carriages that you can start to think of it as a train. I say carriages, I mean trailers. It's this kind of mixing of terminology, but I think it goes back probably a few decades in Australia, that particular term. They allow in some parts of the country and some states up to 4 trailers, which I believe is quite unique. I'm not even sure, don't quote me on this, but that anyone in North America quite allows that much, and to a total length of 53 meters, I'm told, in the Northern Territory in some parts of the country, last time I checked. We're talking, and there are actually trains in cities around the world that are shorter than that, and I've been on them. So it deserves that title. It's just a really, really massive truck, in short.
And it would be challenging to drive. I've heard the term here in the States, they call it a wiggle wagon, because the trailers, I would imagine, do what they want to do in certain circumstances. That's harder to control.
I believe that if something gets out of hand at the back, it can, or at the front, let's say, it can be really exaggerated by the time things get to the effects play out at the back of the truck. I guess that goes for any truck. I didn't get to drive a road train because of timing and visa and license restrictions. So that part of the dream I didn't quite get to, but I did get to drive a truck in the Outback. I found a way around it. I found a loophole to drive a smaller truck across the Outback. So I got close enough that I'm going to say I did it. And the road train is very difficult to drive, I would imagine. But yeah, I can only speculate on that, but the dynamics involved are pretty, just everything's on another scale, right?
Oh, sure. What are the challenges of driving in the Outback? What's the weather like and all of that?
So you do get a lot of talk about these sort of massive storms that will come in at certain times of the year. I actually was driving sort of from January to March, and was kind of living in expectation of the wet season coming in up in the north. So you have the kind of tropical northern end of Australia where you have this very defined dry and wet season, and then the rest of the country is pretty much dry nearly all of the time once you get away from the coast. Weather-wise, conditions are pretty good in general, unless you would get hit by one of these storms. Actually, in my very first assignment, which was challenging on a number of levels, I mean, I wrote a whole chapter on this. It was my toughest assignment. It just happened to be my first one. We were going from Perth up to Karratha, which is up in the mining area, northwestern Australia. And there was this kind of threat hanging over us that a tropical cyclone was moving in, exactly the kind of storm I was talking about, is kind of common for that time of year. And we had this kind of race against time. We have to get in and drop the load before the cyclone comes, and then we got to get back home and get away and miss the storm. In the end, it came to nothing. It was a couple of days behind us and wasn't that bad in the end. But that's the kind of thing that the other drivers who are more experienced would kind of scare you with, was all this weather talk. As it happened, I never really got anything like that in my time. And you can put it down to climate change, maybe. I don't know. I think the wet season has not been arriving as it normally used to for a number of years now. So yeah, otherwise, as I said, apart from the occasional dodgy road, the highways are good. Being bored is probably the number one hazard, which I guess is also a theme in North America, where you just have a long road and it's straight and there's not much traffic, and you got to keep awake. And the other thing, I suppose, kangaroos, wildlife.
You have herds of kangaroos in Australia, don't you?
They do go around in quite large packs sometimes. The tricky thing with the roos is that they are nocturnal. And unless you're a very lucky driver who gets to work, from sunrise to sunset and then park up, and I wasn't one of those lucky drivers, you can be underway at night. And these things, they just appear from nowhere. If they decide they're going to spring across the road out of the shadows, you don't really have much of a chance of avoiding them. which is sad. I did my best, without swerving the truck or anything. Sometimes you could see them next to the road. They would be on drinking out of the little puddles next to the road, because you had these kind of drainage ditches.
Sure.
Sometimes they would tank up there, and you could see that they might be thinking about it. So you could reduce your speed a little bit, but they were not dangerous to a driver. They were, unfortunately, it would definitely come off second best, and you wouldn't really feel it. The thing you had to watch out for was cows. Because there's a lot of unfenced ranches all over Australia in the interior, and cows just can be anywhere. And of course, it can be the middle of the night, and it can stand in the middle of the road. That's where I was told you do not want to have a coming together, because then you might come off second best.
Yeah, they're much bigger than roos, I imagine.
Exactly. Quite a lot more beef on them.
Exactly. We're speaking with R.A. Dalkey. He's an author who's driven trucks in the Australian Outback. He's got some great stories. We have to go to break here. This is the Truckers Network Radio Show on TNCRadio.live. Stay tuned for more coming up. Budgeting tips for over-the-road truck drivers. Budgeting can be rather overwhelming at first. It requires a plan and self-discipline, but there's no need to be scared. Once you get the hang of budgeting, it'll become easy and will no longer feel like you're restrained from your finances. It's a good feeling to know exactly how much you're spending and where your money's going. Start budgeting today, and you'll begin to save money and see a difference in your finances. Here are some great budgeting tips for over-the-road truck drivers. Know your why. The first step to creating a budget is understanding your why. What is your reasoning for creating a budget? What do you want to accomplish? Are you trying to pay off debt? Are you trying to save for a big purchase? Or are you just wanting to be more conscious of your spending? Knowing your why before creating a budget will help motivate you and keep you on track. Set goals. Setting goals will help you achieve your why. To pay off debt or to save a specific amount, you need to know how much you need to be saving and budgeting each month. It's much easier to save and budget when you have a specific goal. Saving just to save does not always keep you motivated. Know your income. Since drivers typically get paid by the mail, drivers have a fluctuating income. Unless you have a dedicated route, your paychecks will vary. Drivers with a set income have a much easier time creating their budget because they know the exact amount they're bringing in every month. If you have a fluctuating income, it's best to know your baseline, meaning you need to know the bare minimum expenses that you need to cover every month. Analyze your spending. Next, you'll need to analyze your spending habits. You can do that by looking at your bank account and examining where you're spending most of your money. Are you spending most of your money at truck stops? Fast food restaurants? Another great way to evaluate your spending is to make a list in a notebook or your cell phone for every purchase you make throughout the month. Keeping track of your spending will not only give you an idea of how much you're spending each month, it will also make you more mindful of your spending. Needs versus wants. When budgeting, it's important to know the difference between needs versus wants. Things you need as a truck driver: food, place to sleep, clothing, toiletries. Things you may want: entertainment, TV, video games, computers, Netflix or Hulu subscription, accessories for your rig. As a budgeter, you need to pay attention to your needs first and save for the things you want. Set a limit. Setting a spending limit is the best way to keep yourself from overspending. Write down all your necessary living expenses and keep in mind how much you want to save each month. Then determine how much you want to spend. A good method to help you set a limit is the envelope system. Budgeting takes time and self-discipline. It's not easy at first, but over time, it will become easier and easier. Want to advertise on TNCRadio.live? Take advantage of great discounts for 2021. Check out the sponsors page at TNCRadio.live or send an email to info@tncradio.live. This is the Truckers Network radio show on TNCRadio.live. I'm Shelley Johnson here with Tom Kelly, and we're speaking with R.A. Dalkey. He's an author and journalist who's written and driven trucks in the Australian Outback. Richard, we were talking about the Outback. I think a lot of people think of Mad Max movies and so forth. Is the Outback a lot like that, or is that kind of an exaggeration?
You know, I tried to watch that movie once and I could not get on with it. It wasn't my thing. I think I gave up after about 20 minutes. So I can't answer that exactly, but for me it was kind of based on real journalism, let's say, the National Geographics and so on, and the travel books I'd seen. And I would say it pretty much did conform to that if you could seek out the right places. It's just, miles and miles of emptiness and nothingness and very light traffic. Only a couple of roads kind of going through the center of the country that are worthy of the name, let's say. There's always a level deeper you can go, right? So you can be driving across the middle of Australia through the through the highway through the Northern Territory and thinking, but what would be really hardcore would be if I was on a camel, 1,200 miles west of here, and I wasn't even on a road. So I can't tell you what that's like. I tried my best now and then to get out into to really experience that outback life, even if it was there was one time I took a swag, it's a kind of tent sleeping bag combination thing for Australian outdoors people, and parked the truck up one night and went off into the bush, not very far, probably 100 yards or so. Mm-hmm. But, I just slept under the stars there to say, I was actually sleeping in the outback, and it was so close to the highway. Didn't qualify as super wild, but I tried to get as close to that dream as possible of the real, almost dangerously dry, deserted outback. But of course, you need to know how to survive in the wilds if you're going to get to that level. And I wasn't prepared to go that far in the time I had under the circumstances I had.
Oh, and to still be quite the experience. Is it pretty extensive to get we call it a CDL here, but to get a license to drive in Australia?
Yeah, so my dream of becoming a road train driver got shattered pretty early once I started looking at all that, because you have to go through the levels. Maybe there's something similar in the States, but you had to get your rigid license, as they call it. And then there was the next level up, which was kind of, you could tow trailers, but not to the extent of the road train. You had to hold each of those licenses for a year, and then you could go for a road train license. So essentially only into your third year could you start that. I went to Australia with a 1 year working holiday visa. So the maths didn't work. You just couldn't. And then I looked at whether there was any equivalent license anywhere else in the world. Could I go to the UK or South Africa, the other countries where I have connections, or even New Zealand? Could I go and qualify on one of their licenses and then, come straight into Australia when this visa was running and say, look, I can swap this for a road train license? And at least at the time, that wasn't really possible. They were kind of the approach that there's nothing as big and difficult as a road train anywhere else in the world. Therefore, you've got to do the license here in Australia, which I kind of understood. Hence, it didn't quite happen at the top level for me.
What are the average hours of service? Do they have? Is it pretty heavily regulated? I know it is here in the U.S. and so forth, and in Canada.
Yeah, so in terms of how long you can drive at a single stint, there were different rules for every state in Australia. A lot of them were quite similar, but at least in Western Australia, where I was based, and where my employer was based, and I guess that's the rules that governed us, it was 5.25 hours that you could go without a break, according to your logbook anyway, which I found quite a lot. I never went that far. That was too much for me. I'm more of a 4-hour guy on a good day. That was a push. I thought it was quite generous of the lawmakers, actually. I don't know how that compares in the States.
I would have to ask our driver partner. Tom, do you remember? We've discussed it here on the air, but do you remember how many hours max before a break? I know it changes, and it has been different since the pandemic too.
Yeah, that's the problem. Is that it depends on what you're driving, where you're driving. That's the frustration we have in the States right now. Is it depends. Are you driving something that is important? And where are you driving it to? And what does important mean? And which governor has assigned which? And it gets very frustrating for the drivers because, well, if I'm driving tanker in this location between now and December the 31st, I can go 10 hours. But if I'm over here, I can go 12. And it's just...
Okay. Well, what I would say for Australia is it was quite simple. They didn't have that level of complexity going on. And you only have 6 states. So... you can be driving 3 days before you have to worry about another set of regulations.
Okay. So what are the drivers like there? I think that we all think of Crocodile Dundee and that sort of thing. I imagine that there's some great personalities. I bet you met some really great drivers.
I didn't actually get to meet a real Crocodile Dundee. I think the guy that actually interviewed me might have been one in his time, but he'd kind of retired. And when I went for the job interview, I mean, I ended up writing almost a chapter on this as well because the job interview was just nuts. I didn't answer a single question. I mean, I sat down in the guy's office and basically he spent half an hour trying to scare me. And he really was talking about crocodiles. Why shouldn't you wade through a river when it's crossing a road in the Northern Territory? Because there'll be a crocodile up there and that billabong up the road, and it's going to swim down the stream and bite your ankles, etc. And all these, when there's a flood in the desert, there's going to be snakes washing across the road and a great big tsunami. I didn't really have to answer any of this. I think the fact that I didn't run out of his office screaming, he was happy to give me the job. In terms of the other drivers, I worked with quite a few, had all sorts of personalities. There were a couple of New Zealanders. Mostly they were let's say, genuine, down-to-earth local Aussies. But there were a couple of Kiwis. One of them actually was quite interesting because he was used to be a prison warder in Auckland. And if you've ever watched Once Were Warriors or something, you know that could be pretty tough. And he was a huge guy. I mean, his handshake nearly killed me. But he was very, very softly spoken, actually. And he didn't understand my South African accent, and I didn't quite get his Kiwi accent, even though we're both English speakers. And we hardly spoke for 5 days, but he was no trouble. I had one of my longest assignments with him, actually, the ex-prison warder, which was quite funny. And then I had some drivers who were quite negative as well. There was a bit of moaning going on from the other New Zealand guy. He was not as pleasant. And all sorts of topics up for conversation. You get a lot of time to chat, of course, because we were always driving 2 up, because I was doing emergency deliveries. So it was keeping the truck rolling nonstop. So I did get to meet quite a few different types.
Had you driven before this, or was this your first stint?
This really was the only reason I got my truck driving license. So I had logged miles in driving tests only, in truck driving tests only. I mean, obviously I had driven a car for many years, but in terms of truck driving, it had just been my various tests. And I'm not good at tests. People who read the book will get to grips with that quite quickly. I did a few tests. I'm not a fan of practical driving tests at all. I don't get on with them and all the pressure. But yeah, of course, the first time I drove on the road in a non-test situation was actually that first run out of Perth up to Karratha with the tropical cyclone threatening, which was also the first time I drove with a load on the back of the truck. And it just makes you realize how much they're missing in the test. Trying to put so much pressure on you, but then maybe some of the things that would be important, would like trying a truck with a load, get missed.
Yeah, that's kind of weird. It's kind of important because that's why people drive truck.
Yeah, and it behaves kind of differently when you've got a ton of concrete piping on the back.
Absolutely. We've got about a minute before we go to break. What's the favorite brand of tractor in Australia? I know here some people really like Peterbilts and Kenworths and that sort of thing.
So I saw a lot of Kenworth and Western Star. That seems to be the prime mover that they like between those two for the road train, for the really heavy lifting. The trucks I drove were actually Japanese. Was a Datsun or Nissan Condor mostly that I would drive. But as I said, I didn't get to drive the heavy metal and had to settle for something a bit smaller for my assignments. But yeah, mostly Western Star and Kenworth from North America.
Very cool. We're talking with R.A. Dalkey. He's an author and journalist who drove trucks in the Australian Outback. He's got some fascinating stories. You're listening to the Truckers Network radio show on tncradio.live. Stay tuned for more coming up. 6 safety tips for truck driving in hot weather. Driving in the heat can create dangerous situations for truck drivers. Drivers need to take specific precautions before hitting the road in extreme heat. When there's an incoming heat wave, drivers need to be aware of how to safely drive in these weather conditions. Follow the Truckers Network's 6 safety tips for truck driving in hot weather. Every truck driver needs to complete a pre-trip inspection before driving, especially in hot weather. Check your tires. Heat can have a huge effect on your tires. As the temperature increases, so does the air pressure in your tires. During the hottest months of the year, it's important to frequently check your tire pressure. Frequently checking your tires can save you from a blowout. To get an accurate measurement, wait for your tires to cool down before checking the pressure. The heat and friction from the road causes your tires to warm up, which will cause a rise in tire pressure. Also, don't be afraid to take a break every couple of hours to let your tires cool down. Protect your engine. Not only should you protect yourself from the heat, but you should also protect your engine. One way to keep your engine from overheating is to frequently check the engine oil. The oil keeps the engine cool and keeps the parts running smoothly. Engine coolant is just as important as engine oil. Coolant helps prevent the engine from overheating in extremely hot temperatures. Keep an eye on the coolant temperature gauge while driving. If the gauge goes above the safe temperature, pull over and see what's going on. Failing to look at the situation could lead to engine failure. Also, make sure to check for leaks in the hoses. A cracked hose can lead to engine failure. Check your brakes. Cold and hot weather affect your semi-truck's brakes. When you brake, you create a significant amount of friction and your brakes become extremely hot. When you add in hot weather, your brakes have an even higher chance of failing. To avoid your brakes from failing, brake gradually to decrease the amount of heat. Also, regularly check your brake pads to ensure they're working properly. Tips to protect yourself from the hot weather. It's just as important to protect yourself during extremely hot weather. Follow these tips to keep yourself cool and safe. Stock up on water. As the temperature increases, you need to increase your water intake. Make sure to always have water in your truck. You never know when you might get stuck in traffic or break down on the side of the road. Wear sunscreen. Many truck drivers forget this step. Even when you're in your truck, you're still exposed to the harmful UVA rays. Make sure to put sunscreen on before hitting the road. Wear light-colored clothes. Light-colored clothing reflects light, and dark-colored clothing absorbs it. Wearing light-colored, loose-fitting clothes helps you stay cooler and more comfortable.
Hey, what's up, y'all? This is Claire Dunn, and you're listening to TNCradio.live.
This is the Truckers Network radio show on tncradio.live. I'm Shelley Johnson here with Tom Kelly, and we're talking with R.A. Dalkey, who's an author and journalist. He's driven trucks in the Australian Outback. He's had quite the experiences. We've been talking a little bit about that. Richard, I wanted to talk a little bit about your latest book, The Road to Innamincka. That's based in Australia, correct? Could you kind of give us a little information on what's that book about?
Yeah, I'll read you the first couple of paragraphs from the description. I just brought it up here, and it might be the best answer to your question. So when a 9-year-old R.A. Dalkey decided he was going to become an Outback truck driver, the poor Australia besotted boy had no idea what he was getting into. He'd been born on the wrong continent for a start, because I'm from Cape Town, South Africa. And even if he could make it out of Africa one day, where was an Australian work visa to come from? Or for that matter, a license to drive 53-meter trucks on red desert roads. And it goes on. But that kind of gives you a flavor for the fact that it's not really just about my time there. It really is this kind of narrative of trying to get towards a goal that actually wasn't easy to get to from where I started out. There were numerous things standing in the way, particularly on the paperwork front. Yeah. And of course, the fact that, people expect you to be a grown up at some point and not do things like this when you're trained to be a journalist, disappear off to Australia and drive trucks just for an adventure. But yeah, and it's a journey that it starts in Cape Town. It spends a bit of time quite a lot of time in the UK, where I did some of my driving tests. Also even goes to the States very briefly, to Los Angeles, a bit of New Zealand. And then we get slowly into Australia. Sort of the second 2/3 of the book is me getting there. And I also experienced city life in Australia. I worked in Sydney for 6 months. So it's a portrait of the country as well as the truck driving part, which really gets going in the third sector, the third of the 3 parts. But you have the thread from the very beginning, which is how I'm going to make this truck driving thing happen. But at the same time, you're seeing the world and you're seeing Australia.
It sounds very compelling and very interesting. And for travelers, which our drivers are, I would think it'd be really interesting. And you have it as an audiobook so they can listen to it.
That's coming up. It will be... I've narrated the first 9 chapters. As you know, that's hard work. But I'm hoping within a month I'm going to have that out. And when I give my link later on, it'll be available on that same link as the ebooks and the paperbacks.
Excellent. You've done some other books too.
Yes. There's also an automotive theme to the first one, which is Never Drive a Hatchback to Austria, which is... It's another chapter of life, let's say. I won't confuse everyone, but it's about a road trip across Europe and how I ended up living in Vienna, Austria now. So yeah, there's a very much smaller and less powerful vehicle involved in that, but one that you can learn to love nonetheless. And then there's another book which is really a pure travel book, which is kind of a collection of shorter stories of my budget travel adventures, let's say, driving on or traveling the world on extremely little money, perhaps nothing. So I'm talking more like, instead of staying in hostels, like sleeping in the park, you sort of next level budget stuff where it's actually free. I've got quite a few adventures like that, including sleeping out on the streets of Monte Carlo, which I think is quite rare for the millionaire's playground. So hence I went for the title Monte Carlo for Vagabonds on that book.
I like that. That's good.
Yeah, and then we got to Innamincka. That's the third of the of, let's say, the broadly speaking travel and autobiographical travel books that I've written.
So you've kind of taken an unconventional approach as a journalist. This would actually lend some great perspective, I would think, as a writer and a journalist, because you've seen a lot of different things other reporters may not see.
Yeah, that's, I suppose it's not something that I set out to do. And part of all this is I was going to do it anyway, even if I wasn't a reporter. And part of it is also writing the books now, because journalism is difficult these days to make a living, and I'm freelance. So publishing these books is another way of going directly to readers and hopefully paying the rent a little bit that way, because we all know what's happening to newspapers and magazines around the world.
Oh, yeah.
But I like to continue to put my training to good use, hence writing the books. I still love writing travel articles, in a magazine. That's always going to be my first love. Well, it doesn't have to be travel. It could be anything. just opinion pieces and so on. But I mean, yeah, writing a nice 1,000 word piece is just the best. I love that, and you can really polish it and make it perfect. But I've tried to do the same with my books, although doing that takes a lot longer when you've got 30 chapters.
Oh, sure, absolutely. So as a journalist, I'm sure you've been keeping track of what's going on, having been a driver and everything, what's happening with the driver shortage in the UK, and what's your perspective? I know that we've heard reports here from the United States, but not necessarily from somebody on the other side of the pond, if you will. What is really happening? What do you have a kind of an opinion or perspective on that?
Yes, so I've kind of been looking at the news at the moment, having just released my book, which, as I mentioned, has a few chapters up front on my experiences doing my driving test in London, England, truck driving test specifically. And I'm kind of looking at the news and thinking, well, I told you so, or I am not surprised. And I kind of did write this in my book before all this happened, that well, if there's a minute, I'll read the paragraph out.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So this is in the middle of, I don't know, chapter 10 or something. And this is where I've just realized how much, what I'm really getting into with this testing and lessons process and how much it's going to cost. My instructor that I've got hold of on the phone is just telling me I've got to get my test booked long in advance because there's a terribly long waiting list, and that it's going to cost £50 an hour, and I'm probably going to need 7 or 8 2-hour lessons. And, I'm just kind of on the verge of fainting. And I wrote this paragraph, which I'll read up. With test fees weighing in at a couple of £100 and 2 tests to prepare for, there was no doubt now that the bill for all of this was going to run well into 4-figure territory. If becoming a truck driver had been designed to swallow up my entire salary for the next couple of months, a better job could hardly have been done. Luckily, I could afford it. But such barriers to entry for a fundamentally working class job, when there was a shortage of qualified drivers, at a time when the government was banging on about unemployment and economic recovery, Britain had got itself into a terrible tangle, if you asked me. So that's the paragraph, and it kind of sums up things that I was posting on Facebook at the time in 2013. And now I get to say told you so, because it is clear that Britain has got itself into a tangle. The fact that it costs so much to do lessons, I believe, has been a little bit underplayed, and the fact that you had to wait so long for lessons, and I can go into this in great detail, but there's a lot of barriers to entry that would put you off, cost and time being one of them. But that is just one of the factors. There is Brexit and COVID. There are things like the fact that European Union drivers, that they were very reliant on the Polish, and people from Eastern Europe might have come over in a more, I won't say desperate, but it was economically attractive to come to Britain if they came 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. Now things have leveled off, and they can live quite well at home with the way their economies are going, and they don't need Britain anymore. And that's also a factor that hasn't been discussed very much, because I think even without Brexit, that would be an issue. And there's a few other things like tax rules and so on. I could go into quite a lot of detail on that.
So essentially, it's not super desirable to be a driver in the UK then. It sounds like, I think I'd heard that they don't pay as well, that sort of thing. Their pay equity issues and all of that. And it sounds like it's kind of tough.
Yeah, I haven't heard anyone saying that it's a well-paid job in the UK. And of course, there's this tax thing that has prevented drivers from registering their own companies and effectively working as freelancers, which has caused them to have to pay more tax.
Oh, so they can't be owner-operators there?
That might be a different thing. I'm not sure. This is more targeting people who are working for agencies or other operators on almost a full-time basis, but defining themselves as freelancers. This was a thing that was designed to make sure they weren't getting off lightly on tax. The effect has apparently been really bad. We're being told. Because the costs now for agencies and operators are having to be passed on in the form of pay cuts, or at least not being able to give pay rises. And this is a non-Brexit, non-COVID thing that is also playing a role. It's a perfect storm of things that have come together at the same time, some which could be foreseen. Obviously, COVID couldn't. And that has been a huge factor. There's no doubt about that. If you look at the statistics of just the number of tests that were performed, obviously 2020 and 2021 have been way down. They lost about 2/3 of the usual testing rate. So clearly that has played a major role as well in things really coming to a head now, but it's kind of the tip of the iceberg.
Wow. Yeah. So it's kind of the culmination of the infinite wisdom of bureaucrats, politicians, and then a virus that have made things super difficult. And a lack of foresight, maybe? That seems to kind of go along with politicians and bureaucrats, too.
Well, I think these politicians should read my books. It's not the first time I've had to put a footnote in saying, yeah, exactly that. Subsequently to me writing these words, I've become aware that the politicians should be reading my books.
And I think all of the drivers here in the United States would definitely agree with you. So we have to go to break here, Richard. This is fascinating. We're talking with R.A. Dalkey. He's an author and journalist. He's driven trucks in the Australian Outback, and he's got some great insight. Definitely stay tuned. You're listening to the Truckers Network radio show on TNCRadio.live. Being on the road can make you feel free, excited, and adventurous. It can also make you feel lonely and even depressed. So it's important for truckers, especially long-haul truck drivers, to bring items on the road to keep them entertained. Truckers have 10 hours off for a 24-hour day. Depending on how long the driver sleeps, there can be several hours where the trucker has nothing to do. We've broken down the list of essential items to keep in your truck in several different categories. The second category we talk about is entertainment. Laptop or tablet. Bring a laptop or tablet and stream your favorite movies or TV shows. If you don't have access to Wi-Fi or a personal hotspot, you can still bring your laptop, some DVDs, and watch a movie. Game console. Playing games is a great way to keep yourself entertained. You can also play with your friends. Bring your Xbox or PlayStation and set up your own gaming station in the cab of your truck. Puzzles, crosswords, or cards. If gaming or watching movies don't interest you, bring some puzzles or crosswords to solve. You can also get a deck of cards and play games like Solitaire, March Same Rank, Devil's Grip, Klondike. Books. Reading books is a great way to pass time and improve brain connectivity. Some popular trucker books include The Highway by C.J. Box, Blue Highways by William Least Heat Moon, Paradise Valley by C.J. Box, Rough Way to the Highway by Kelly Mac McCoy. Exercise equipment. Truck drivers' health suffers from the lack of exercise. Bringing exercise equipment on the road will keep you entertained and improve your overall well-being. There's several portable exercise equipment items you can store in the cab of your truck. They include dumbbells, resistance bands, kettlebells, and running shoes.
For the latest in traffic, weather, and information, catch the Morning Grind weekdays right here on TNCRadio.live.
This is the Truckers Network radio show on TNCRadio.live. I'm Shelley Johnson here with Tom Kelly, and we're talking with R.A. Dalkey, who's an author and journalist who's driven trucks in the Australian Outback, and he's got some fascinating stories. Tom, you said you had a question for Richard.
So, Richard, my question's this. Was there a point when you were driving through the Australian Outback or some, through all of that where you went, this is the dumbest idea I've ever come up with. What am I doing here? And just wanted to get on the next plane and leave because it just was not fun.
More than once.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say I wanted to leave the country, but of course, yes. When it was, the middle of the night, when I dreamed of driving a road train as a kid, it was never that I was going to be driving at 2:00 in the morning, fighting to stay awake. That wasn't the dream. It was driving in broad daylight with the music pounding, wide awake, stopping to eat as much as I wanted. The reality, the only job I could get with that license to drive long distance was the hot shots, as they call it, which I believe they use in North America as well, the emergency deliveries. So often not carrying very much of a load, but that didn't matter because they were paying big money and they just wanted it yesterday. So yeah, there was a lot of driving on very short notice, driving in the middle of the night. And, there were a couple of times we went from Perth over towards Queensland and of course, Innamincka on this famous journey which gives the name to my book. And, when it's day 5 and you're on the way home and both of you are just, you have to pull the truck over because neither driver can keep awake anymore. Those moments are not fun at all. But then there were, of course, so many other times when I was like, yeah, I'm actually doing this, especially that very first trip. And you couldn't buy that feeling.
Would you do it again?
I don't know if I would do the hot shots driving again. Because that particular style of work was definitely, it was a big compromise on my part because it was the only kind I could get. I didn't like being on call, waiting for the boss to ring anytime, especially if it's getting towards the end of the day and then he says, are you free to go up to Karratha, 12 hours drive? I didn't like that style. But if you said to me, I can go and drive trucks, particularly bigger trucks, given time to get the license and do it on a schedule, I'd go, but you'd have to give me an Australian visa as well. Like I said, these barriers are everywhere you look, and I would also do it in North America potentially. Again, no work rights whatsoever, but those countries where you have a lot of space and big wide skies, that's appealing to me. To do it in Europe, absolutely no interest, not with the traffic and the roads and the stress.
Well, the roads in Europe aren't really designed for big vehicles.
No, I don't think the Romans had trucks in mind when they started laying them out. And Britain is the worst. I mean, most of Europe is choked with traffic, but Britain is next level. And it was actually described by a Polish truck driver that was interviewed in a video I saw the other day with Deutsche Welle, I think it was, with the German broadcaster, and he was again describing how Britain was the worst place in Europe, and maybe if you were Polish a long time ago, you just went with it, and the money was good and so on. But now Germany's much better; they have better facilities all over the continent, much better, and Britain is a nightmare with so many roadworks going on and basically no facilities specifically for truckers. So
I bet parking's a problem there too.
I think parking is a problem for anything bigger than a bicycle in Europe.
Oh, geez.
And that's absolutely no fun. I'm not particularly interested in reversing maneuvers with trucks. I did that on my tests, and I also did them on my tests with cars, and I've managed to pretty much avoid them in real life. In 20 years of driving all these different categories of vehicle, and Australia has a lot of space. And I said it again in the book. I was like, why am I doing these stupid maneuvers around London and reversing in between poles and stuff? There is no way that in the Outback I'm going to be having to squeeze into a tight space. And indeed, I didn't.
Unless it's to squeeze in and out of a herd of kangaroos or something, right?
I did my best, but as I said, I hit the occasional one.
So we have about 6 minutes here. I wanted to get your quick perspective. Is there an easy solution to this supply chain quagmire and driver shortage? Because it seems to be a worldwide phenomenon, isn't it?
Yeah. I think that the barriers to entry, broadly speaking, all over the world are an issue. Whether you talk about Australia or the UK, for example, there's this thing where you have to go through one level of license to get to the next one. And each of that is a round of costs, and it's a round of waiting for a test date, and it's a round of waiting for something to come in the mail, all this kind of thing. In Britain, there's also this additional certificate of professional competence thing you have to do. You have to do it every 5 years. So even you kind of get punished for having experienced in a way, like, you've done 5 years, now you have to go and do more exams. And that costs money. And I think it's probably a little bit insulting to people who've been doing this job for a while. So it's one of those things that could just put people off. And the cost of lessons is also crazy. I have to tell you, the guy that I did my training with in London, he drove an Aston Martin. And I thought, something's not right here. I'm happy to pay you for fare, but that seems to be doing very well as a driving instructor.
Yes.
Yeah. And if it has to cost that much and be that difficult, I don't know. I just think that if we need more taxpayer money to go towards driver training that is affordable and fast, and that, having more slots so that people don't have to wait 3 months to get a test, which of course creates the extra pressure, right? Because you're thinking, if I fail this, A, I've lost all this money, but B, I've got to wait another 3 months and I can't carry on with my life.
Sure.
So that creates more pressure, and you probably do fail, or you think, this is so stressful, I'm not going to do it at all. So there's so many levels on which these barriers to entry could be reduced. And if I was in charge, I would really be looking at making it obviously not easier tests. That's highly debatable. But, the little administrative things that could be simplified, quickened up, made cheaper, subsidized. Yes, I'd be looking at that.
I think the drivers here would agree with you. Regulations and bureaucratic nonsense just really, really slow things down and make it possible. Yeah.
And the other thing, of course, is on the immigration and visa side. If you are lucky enough to be in a country where people want to come and move to your country and work, and that goes for Australia and America. Britain has burnt a lot of bridges lately, and a lot of the Polish are saying, "Good luck. You said you didn't want us," but the people at the top, it's crazy. Canada, Australia, America, as far as I'm aware. There's still an issue with truck driving being put on the list of skilled trades that allows you to get an easy visa to come like a doctor or a nurse can, which seems ridiculous.
Yeah. Your perspectives are very, very interesting. You've had a fascinating set of experiences here, and I know your books are really something that people would like to read or even hear, because you have it in audiobooks. Where do people find your books, Richard?
So the easiest place they can go is directly online to a link called books2read.com. That's books and then the number 2 and then read.com/trucking. Quite simply, books2read.com/trucking. And there you will have all the links to all the ebook stores that you can think of. And if you go to that Amazon link, you would be able to order a paperback, and give it another month or so. There will also be all your audiobook links as well.
And do they look under R.A. Dalkey, Dalkey?
Well, that will go directly to the right page for that book. But if you want to just Google me, then yes, R.A. Dalkey, Dalkey, and that should come up with something that gets you to the right place. If Amazon's your thing, then put R.A. Dalkey in there, and it should pop up.
Okay. Do you have your own website as well?
No. Okay. No, on my to-do list.
Okay. Totally understand. Yeah. Well, a lot of these e-commerce sites are also a great place. And we're going to feature a link to your book as well here on tncradio.live. So that'll be easy for the drivers to check you out and check out the books you've got. We have about a minute left. What is your summary for drivers from the Australian and European perspective?
Well, I'd say you're all doing a great job, as I think you're all aware that you're doing an important job, but you knew that all along. And it's just a shame that it's not been appreciated for so many years. But I think that the world is waking up to the important job that truckers are doing. And perhaps I could end off by mentioning a sticker that, well, not a sticker, but a little badge that goes on the back of many, many trucks in Australia. And this goes back to before driver shortages and COVID and everything. They had these trucks with the insignia, "Without trucks, Australia stops."
Excellent.
And that's been an understanding the Aussies have had for a very, very long time, living in a big country with long distances.
Amen to
and it's
that.
maybe something Europe could learn from.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. You're listening to TNCradio.live. This has been the Truckers Network Radio Show. Stay tuned for more coming up. Thank you for listening to another great interview on TNCRadio.live and the Truckers Network Radio Show. All of the material you hear on TNCRadio.live on our website, our broadcasts, or our podcasts are copyrighted. There can be no distribution without the express consent of TNCRadio.live and its partners. For inquiries, write us at info@tncradio.live. PO.live. 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 PO.live.